Hello, everyone. Good morning. Stravo. Um, very happy to be here. A huge thank you to Mateusz and the entire LINA team. I'm I've been saying for many years, before LINA was even LINA, was Future Architectures, that how much I appreciate that it is a sort of organization that really decenters the way we think of Europe, and even for a Ljubljana-based organization to not really obey to the sort of like Slovenian impetus to look west and to look towards the European Union, all the way to the point of building a wall on the border with Croatia that I was able to document many years ago when it was, some years ago when it was built. So I really, really appreciate LINA to look east quite often, whether it's in Kosovo, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Albania, in Romania, and even a place that is geographically not east, but is east in my heart, which is Ireland. So I'm very grateful for this clear recentering or decentering of Europe as we know it, especially with the sort of self-importance of colonial West Europe. I'm also very grateful to be here. Sarajevo is a very important place for me. I was between 6 and 9 years old during the siege, and Sarajevo was a sort of name that came back every day almost in my child's mind. And so it stayed, and then when I was lucky enough to visit for the first time 10 years ago, it had a very strong impact on me. And then yesterday, when I was reconnecting with the city, it still did. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in just a bit. So this is a bit like, I mean, where we are is a bit what some people in settler colony would call a place acknowledgement, but I would like to make a time acknowledgement as well, which is to acknowledge the fact that while we are talking, Israel is continuing its genocidal campaign in Gaza and South Lebanon now. And I think that's particularly something we can have in mind while we're just in a few months here in Bosnia. We will commemorate the 40th years anniversary, the 30th year, sorry, anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, genocidal massacre. And so I think sometimes acknowledging the time we're in is something we ought to do more often. And then the last thing I would say as an introduction is I really appreciate that particular commission, that job, as you say, Mateusz, of asking me to think about what I interpreted to be what those 15 last year have been in architecture. As I will say in just a second, it's of course a very subjective vision. You'll see that it starts with a bunch of white men, but it will get better as it goes. But also perhaps that's the way to I should say right off the bat that the reason why it is like that is of course not that there was not women of the global south or women, racialized women in the global north who didn't work very strongly on all those questions, but they were not given access to the sort of infrastructure of knowledge diffusion. So that also explains how an entire discipline is being influenced and how they are such a thing as an infrastructure of in the audience, so we're in it together. And then perhaps a very important aspect of my training has been my first visit to Palestine in 2008. I think I might have made someone unhappy, sorry. Yeah, sorry, my first trip to Palestine has been really, as much as I don't really like the idea of epiphanies and then, you know, someone like a white person from the West realizing something all of a sudden at some point of their life, I have to say, like, my first trip to Palestine has been exactly that. And especially realizing the, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, okay. Realizing the role that architecture was playing in the Israeli settler colonial machine was absolutely central. It's around that time that I started with a couple of friends this small blog that is sort of the ancestor of the Funambulist that was called Boîte à Outils, like Toolbox, in which I was trying to write already about the sort of political dimension of architecture and the political complicities of architecture, very importantly. Already defining architecture as the discipline that organizes bodies in space, with all the sort of political implications that might have. In 2010, as Mateusz kindly said, I started the Funambulist as a blog, again, at first of my own sort of writing, bad writing, I should say, but being already in sort of a small community of people who wanted to think about a similar topic, and maybe that's a good shout out to Cesar Reyes and Anadana Beros over there, as being part of that first sort of small group of people trying to really reflect on all those. And it really felt lonely back then, I should say, like, you know, being still in either still in architecture school or a little bit out of it. It felt like hitting a wall quite often. Not so much a wall of antagonism, not so much of people who were like, yeah, not so much of direct conflict, but more of indifference. So I think, you know, perhaps I'm skipping all the way to the conclusion of that presentation, but I feel things have improved very much for the better in the discipline. So I should say this. In 2010 as well, and I was just citing Cesar and Ethel from DPR Barcelona were kind enough to accept to publish my first book, Weaponized Architecture, The Impossibility of Innocence, that was trying to make that argument that architecture is violence, inherently violence, that this violence is always instrumentalized by political regime, that those political regime tended to be, you name it, settler colonialism, heteropatriarcha, ableism, structural racism, anti-blackness, but this book was maybe more attached to the question of Palestine again. And then it became the Funambulist became a magazine in 2015, coming out every 2 months, in which those questions were being asked, but perhaps a tiny bit different way, which is instead of trying to politicize the architecture community, which is still something I try to do to a certain degree, it was trying to intervene within a sort of politically engaged community and ask them to think about space. So that's almost a different move. But anyway, this talk is not about my own work or my own self. And it's much more about, indeed, like trying to reflect on those 15 last year. And I think to do so in Sarajevo, for me, is also something quite important, insofar that I think that Sarajevo had something to do with where we are today in architecture, perhaps worldwide. And, you know, I know that probably among the fellows, the LINA fellows, some people were born maybe in the mid-90s, perhaps even later. It seemed like maybe quite a few in the mid-90s, so perhaps they don't necessarily, and far away from Sarajevo, so perhaps they don't realize what Sarajevo has been for countless people. the way that the Great Library of Sarajevo had been shelled by the Serb paramilitary groups from the hills has really rethought, helped rethought the way that cities and civilian infrastructure were being targeted by aggression, leading all the way to Bogdan Bogdanovic, the former mayor of Belgrade, to not to coin, because the word existed before, but to recoin the term urbicide that we're using right now when we talk about Gaza quite often. How Liebeswoods, from afar from the US, so it's necessarily a vision of an outsider, but still how Liebeswoods influence an entire generation of maybe architects in the West, but very much built on the fact of rethinking how to rebuild a city like Sarajevo, and in this sort of like also this mirror with Ivan Strauss that I find interesting. So I think those are of course before those last 15 years, but I wanted, for me it was important to put Sarajevo at least as one of the genesis of this way of thinking. And of course, you know, again, Sarajevo is definitely not the way Europe think of itself and everything, but it remains a European city. I think similar things can be said about other places in the world, and in Palestine in particular, with Riwaq having been founded in the early 90s in renovating and restoring Palestinian heritage buildings that had been destroyed as a gesture of political resistance. So that seemed important also to say. But so if we now really jump into those last 15 years, although, yeah, 2004, so actually 20 years in that case. As a student, I really remember that book by Stephen Graham as one of, again, in my own subjectivity, one of the first books that really addressed this sort of urban condition of colonialism, of geopolitical invasion and wars. So I think of it as like one of the key sort of books that came out around that time that really influenced perhaps at least my generation, and perhaps the generation above mine as well. And this one even more so, by Yael Weizman and Rafi Segal, Civilian Occupation, so trying to build an exhibition that was totally censored in Israel, and a book documenting the architecture of Israeli colonies in the West Bank. And later on, the books that really very much sort of, I think really built an entire theory on this architecture of violence in the specific context of Palestine, but that could be applied in quite a few other places, by Yael Weizman again, Hololand, that I think was really like a sort of groundbreaking moment in this history. And similarly, Eyal, but more so Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti had started this decolonizing architecture art residencies that, you know, if I remember myself in 2008 or 2009, I was like, wow, that's literally the most interesting thing that is being done in architecture right now, where people would meet in Palestine and like architecture students and architecture graduates and maybe the generation above would meet in Palestine and workshop for like 1 week, and that led to, I think, yeah, that led to someone like me to be greatly influenced by it. Of course, to think of the history of architecture in a vacuum is totally ridiculous. I mean, I guess I was trying not to do it talking about Sarajevo, but I think it's important that in those last 15 years, we also identify a certain amount of world events that really impacted the way we think of the world in general, and therefore how we think of architecture. And of course, the Egyptian Revolution, as well as the Tunisian one, and the various movement in North Africa and the Gulf and the Levant, have been instrumental in rethinking the world, really. In architecture, I think that translated, for example, in those kind of initiatives by friends Ahmad Barclay, Dana Kadumi, and Mohamed Al-Shahed. So Arena of Speculation and Cairo Observer, which are in that case very much my own generation. A.L. Weizmann, of course, continued his trajectory, and in this book, The List of All Possible Evils, he had like a chapter on Gaza that was not called forensic architecture, but that very like it was based on a lecture that was called forensic architecture. And so what was a lecture that became a book chapter later became like the sort of collective that I'm pretty sure we all know today in using all these sort of architectural skills and tools to be able to investigate on colonial crimes and imperial crimes. With, of course, you know, that's 2011. That's one of the very first investigations. So you can see how it looked like back then, and of course how it evolved until now. But even in 2014, during the last massive bombardment and invasion of Gaza that the Israeli army had led in the summer of 2014, maybe many of you remember it. That's already when forensic architecture was able to deploy its tools. And so that takes us to 2015. Something we tried to do at the Funambulist, something I tried to do because at that point it was really just myself at the beginning, was to have a section for architecture students within the magazine itself that was perhaps showing us a little bit how the zeitgeist, or I don't know if that's the right word, in architecture school had been changing, and there was a growing politicization of students working on, I don't know if just looking at here on the north of Ireland, Black America invaded Iraq and Algeria. I also see the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg as being created and directed by Leslie Loco as a massive event in the way that, of course, a massive decentralization of architecture education, where some of us were perhaps looking for a long time at Britain, at the US, perhaps Canada, perhaps Netherlands, I don't know, as like the sort of key places to learn architecture and to very much think, reflect on it. But I think what Leslie created, and I also put Huda and Sumaya as other actors of this project, but there's many more, at the Graduate School of Architecture, is to change the entire way of thinking of architecture education, in particular centering the personal life even of many black and non-white students in South Africa, and in particular women, in building on the heritage of the entire apartheid struggle. So I think, to me, that has been, and that continues to be in many ways, a very important site of where architecture is being reconfigured, so to speak. Still talking about books, I know that for me, the book that Samia Heni has published in 2017 based on her PhD at ETH, Architecture of Counter-Revolution, has been also instrumental in taking a little bit what Eyal Weizmann had been doing on Palestine and applying it. I'm not sure whether Samia would agree with this characterization, but this is more me doing like a sort of that little subjective history, but and so putting it at work in a context of colonial Algeria and the Algerian Revolution and the counter-revolution organized by colonial French. And then, that's around that time that Future Architecture, so the ancestor of LINA, started. So I wanted to sort of, sorry, that's me. That's awkward. And so, I try to, doing a few shoot-out of people who I had the great luck to work with. There was also Merve Bedir as well in the first or the second class, so to speak, but also Feda Wardak, Resolve, Akil and Seth Scave-Smith, Oh yeah, I realized all my slides are cut. Okay, so normally you had names at the bottom, so that's also awkward. So that's and then a little bit further on, Charlotte Malterbart, Dubravka Sekulic, and Meda Aga as being very much part of the community of people who I have the great luck to think with quite often. In 2019, the Chicago Architecture Biennale was also instrumental in the way. I don't know whether the Biennale itself really produced anything new, but at least was a sort of a very good collection of very interesting projects that was done at that time. In particular, the Settler Colonial Project by Anna Maria Leon and Andrew Erscher, that very much like I could have put, I suppose, the fight for Standing Rock against the North Dakota pipeline as also a key moment to rethink of even something like settler colonialism, in particular in a place where it was not necessarily identified as such, namely the US. And then if we continue, something we tried to do at the Funambulist in 2020 was to promote 16 very young architects who well, not literally, but that very much blew my mind in the way that their work was very much constituting a whole new generation that very much grapple with anti-blackness, with settler colonialism, with heteropatriarchy in various places. And 4 of those 16 were indeed students at the Graduate School of Architecture of Johannesburg, and then, of course, an incredible event to witness the impact of has been the Black Lives Matter uprising of 2020. I really don't like centering the US as a key site of sort of epistemologic production. So there's a problem in that, but I think the Black Lives Matter uprising has really just had such an incredible impact, in particular on institutions that have like made this kind of statement from like the sort of the key sites of anti-blackness in the US in particular. I think, you know, I don't believe a word in what those people have to say about anything, but the fact that they were forced to say it, to me, is very, very interesting. So I think it has really profoundly impacted the way even the discipline of architecture has evolved, and in particular in Y Think Tank, Natalie Frankowski and Chris Garcia have been really part of those architects who have very much engaged with that moment. And perhaps one moment in particular that has crystallized many things or gathers many things has been the Venice Biennale of 2023, directed by Leslie Loco, so the former director of the Graduate School of Architecture of Johannesburg. And then I think the work of someone like Tandy Lowenson is very much sort of central to it, but of course there's many more. Back to Palestine, I think, because you know a lot of what I've been talking about is very much in the realms of theory or the ideas, but I think in terms of built environment, I mean, I quoted Feda Wardak and Resolve, who very much built stuff. But I think Elias and Youssef Anastas and the Wonder Cabinet they built on their own, so to speak. I mean, not building, but like design and curated this entire space in Bethlehem, in Occupy Bethlehem. It's literally looking at a massive Israeli colony in front of its windows. Is an incredible example of making space and making space in an occupied territory even more. Again, trying to promote a few LINA fellow. More recently, Margaret Awako was part of LINA, and she was part of the Funambulist adventure for two years and a half as our head of communication. And Mariam Shabani, even though has not been part of the magazine itself, is very much has very much been around for the last 10 years and we literally share offices now. So it's you can have like also this small community at the scale of an office. And then in the magazine, again, something we've been trying to do is to again go back to promote young architecture graduates and their thesis project in particular in the magazine, but no longer as like a separated student section, as in like, oh, those are students, but very much part of the magazine itself. And as you can see, like mobilizing incredible project in Armenia and in Artsakh, in Barbados, in Rwanda, in Brazil, in Taiwan, in Bradford, in the hosting of the Rohingya community. So this is something I'm very, very happy to do. And then as part of the, again, the sort of key moments that and that's kind of the end of the presentation, I think what we have to grapple with towards state of architecture in 2025 is the moment we're in, the moment of massive suppression that we've seen in the key sites of architecture education, such as at Columbia University, with literally the New York Police Department called by Columbia University, besieging the university to get rid of the solidarity encampment with Palestine on campus. Similarly, some of you might have seen the sort of press campaign that was led against some of my friends, including Samia Heni and myself, going as far as censoring a talk I was supposed to give on the architecture of settler colonialism in Palestine at the ETH Zurich, and so ETH canceling that talk, censoring that talk. But you know, it's funny. I was telling a few people yesterday that I would have given the talk in front of 40 students, and instead I gave the talk in front of 800 people as a sort of replacement talk. So I think Palestine won in this particular instance. But this is basically, you know, my first book was called The Impossibility of Innocence, and I think it's even clearer today that there is no longer any innocence that is being afforded to any of us. This talk at ETH was student organized, so we had like those two amazing students who had to deal with quite literally the entire infrastructure of their university, antagonizing them and censoring them. So I think what people need to do now at school is like they have no luxury of time, like they are already engaged in very strong politics. So we need to be there as people outside the school to support them. And so, of course, that's a very particular moment we're living in, a moment of great violence that is raised against us. But I think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I really remember what it used to look like just 15 or 20 years ago, and feeling so alone and feeling so in front of the indifference. Again, like we were not alone because we were quite a few for each other, but it was such a small group. And now today I see so many amazing research and projects that comes from new generations that I think for me gives me a great feeling of optimism. Sorry, I'm almost playing the clock here. I'm saying that in 3 seconds I would have been exactly 30 minutes, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Leopold. Please join me here for a couple of minutes, and let's ask people in the room if there are any questions for Leopold. Yes, there's a hand raised at the end. Hannah will take the microphone.
Hello, there you go. Thank you, Leopold, for that great presentation. Architecture is inherently political, and politicians have a lot of tools at their disposal to work with these complex political situations. Diplomacy, negotiations, economics, conflict management, conflict resolution, etc. How might, in your experience, architecture develop new intersections between the architectural tools that we usually have, the architectural research method, and the political tools and the political methods. How might these be more intertwined to be able to more concretely deal with complex political situations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I would go even one step further than to say architecture is inherently political. I usually say architecture is inherently violent, meaning that it has a great propensity to control bodies in space. So that's why it's so much easier to build a wall between Slovenia and Croatia than it is to create an architectural solution to that particular architectural embodiment of violence. Sometimes we say the bridge, you know, it's like stop building walls, build bridge. But I think bridges themselves are also, I mean, I live in a city where Algerian revolutionaries were thrown from bridges down into the river after being killed. So I think I don't have that sort of very naive idea of the bridge as like joining people, although in the case of Slovenia and Croatia, like having a river in between a bridge is always nice. But I think, you know, I mean, I think perhaps the answer is a little bit in the subtitle of LINA, of this community-based architecture, insofar that I think the entire, I mean, thinking architecture against itself, which is the way that I, much more than doing counter architecture, I don't like putting counter in front of stuff as a way to say, well, you know, I'm not doing architecture, I'm doing counter architecture. I'm not doing cartography, I'm doing counter cartography. So for me, it's more thinking about those things against their own inherently violent characteristic. And I think if we manage somehow to have architects operating within their own communities or communities they are supporting in a very sort of close way, and acting the same way that, you know, a nurse would act when you know, or medics would act when, you know, the cops have has brutalized some of us in protest, or acting like people who will prepare the food for some of those community events, or just like with this sort of humbleness of being just one of many cogs within a certain community, but one that has like very particular skills, which are to think about the community through space and to build to have even a technical skills, but in the whole humbleness of recognizing ourselves as just like this very small element as part of a bigger communities. And to me, that's kind of the answer to that question.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah. If architecture is inherently violent, does it have a chance to counter this tendency? And do you think that community-led development would be a way to do that?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I think we need to demoralize our approach to violence and not necessarily think of it as something to run away from. And I think what's thinking with architecture's violence in a community based can look in many ways, but recognizing that you know, we're surrounded by walls, but what does that mean, for example, to create an LGBTQ space that is protected from fascists to attack it, for example, is one way for me to think of architecture's violence for the community and not for the sort of dominant order, in that case of heteropatriarcha. And so I don't necessarily think that it's about, I really have a huge trouble with the idea of non-violent architecture. I don't think it exists, and I think whichever project starts from that axiom is going to have chances to be even more violent than one that would really look at it closely. Just like, you know, I take the example, but like how sometimes Antifa group like have managed to create violence against the police in a way that would allow for maybe less trained people to escape from being arrested or from being brutalized by the police. I think we have to create an ethics of violence within architecture, and so this is something I've been trying to do for quite a few years, and sometimes that means disobedience, sometimes that means thinking in the sort of gray areas that the colonial order organized, and sometimes it means as simple as protecting the community we're serving against the many violent forces that work against it.
More questions from here for the second row, please.
Lately, we hear a lot of conversation about Europe that is coming from mostly from Eastern European countries, but it feels like we hear very little about this kind of classical Western Europe and what is happening in there. So, do you have like any interest in how things are changing in Western Europe, for example?
What do you have in mind? I don't see many things changing. I just see things staying very much the same, on the contrary.
So it's interesting because like for us, like I'm from Tbilisi, for example, and 20 years ago, there was this kind of romantic idea of how life in Europe is because we went through wars and everything. And from the way I see, Western Europe has changed a lot in the last 20 years, and a lot of the sort of political agenda that you partially mentioned, I think, has to do something with it. So do you think it's also interesting to discuss how sort of wider integration of Eastern European communities and, you know, even further has changed life in Western European countries?
Well, I think obviously there's a very legitimate romanticization of what Western Europe used to be for post-Sovietic societies, but I think this colonial and racialization violence has been there the entire time. I mean, Europe is literally built on, Western Europe is literally built on its colonies. Mateusz said I worked on former French colonies, but also present French colonies, Kanaki, New Caledonia in particular. So to me, it's not really any change. It's more a solidification of the colonial orders that was there the entire time.
So maybe I didn't express myself like too well. I'll try it one more time. So like maybe this kind of idea, this contemporary idea that some retributions have to be done to sort of say sorry for like colonial history and things like that. Some worse things are happening because of that. In an attempt to say sorry, some things are changing for the worse in Western European countries and cities.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure anyone is interested in hearing Western Europe say sorry and more repair what they've done, more importantly. And I think the sort of the post-Soviet world would be also an important place to think that in what, but I mean, it doesn't look like Russia is interested to have that conversation, of course. But I think, yeah, we have to. I think reparation is never going to come from the states themselves. It's going to come from other sort of initiatives, and so that's among ourselves to think about it. But I mean, I'm glad if you think there's been, yeah. I mean, I guess I did say there is some change. There is a new generation and everything, and it's true. But I think we're also proportionally up against an even greater solidification of that fascism that we see in many places. So, so yeah. So I'm an optimist, but also what I call a tactical optimist, which is to really look at what's being done, but not necessarily thinking that things are going for the better.
I'm sorry, we have to move on with the next presentations, but let me just ask you the last question. Almost with every issue we start, we come to education in architecture. And you'll be teaching yourself. What do you think, what are the skills that we miss now in order to be able to better work with communities as architects and urban planners? What should be changed in education?
I mean, there's some things that is inherent to the way architects think of themselves for centuries, I would even say. That is that they're always outside of the communities they pretend to be serving. And I think we have the opportunity to have architects who are part of the communities they are actually serving. So I think it's probably about identifying for those of us who are able to act in their own community to do so, and then for the others to learn how to, if not integrate those communities, because communities don't have to be necessarily, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a sort of family-based or ethnically based community. It can be like someone's neighborhood, or a community of struggle, or communities of care. And so I think being part of a community is probably the best way to be useful to it later with those particular skills architects have, I suppose. So as an education, I would say that perhaps a lot of architecture education should probably not be about architecture.
Thank you, Leopold.